and every time I come here it's like I feel sort of confronted with this vast array of knowledge, and I feel like I could spend days sleeping here and eating, just imbibing all the knowledge in different books. And also I'd be careful about the amount of money I would spend too. But I'm here today to obviously talk mainly about my new book, Out of the Darkness, which came out about 3 or 4 months ago through Hay House. And I'll talk a little bit about the origins of the book, and I'll tell you a little bit about the main ideas of the book, and also I'll talk about what I think are the main implications of the book as well. But obviously I won't go into too much detail. But I think that the book really originated in an experience I had about 4 years ago when I became ill. I had a strange medieval facial complaint called a quinsy, where my face ballooned out into a ridiculous size and I couldn't eat or drink, so I had to go to hospital. And while I was in hospital I picked up a bacterial infection, as you're prone to do in hospital these days. So I became very ill, and I couldn't walk, and I was confined to my bed for 2 weeks or so. But for the first few days I felt very resistant to what was happening. I felt very depressed, especially because it was Christmas and I wanted to be with my family and my young children. But after maybe a week and a half, I began to feel this strange sense of well-being which filled me. I felt as though I'd somehow broken through to a different level of being, and I'd gained access to this sense of serenity and a well-being which wasn't part of my normal consciousness. And this stayed with me even once I was back home and I'd recovered over the following weeks and months. This sense of well-being and serenity stayed with me and became less intense, but it became integrated into my normal state, I would say. And it was combined with a massive sense of appreciation for my body, even now that it was in good working order. I felt this sense of meaning and connection. So that was my first real experience, my first real personal experience of how illness and suffering can have a positive spiritual effect. And then I was doing the research for this book, and I was collecting many examples of what I call awakening experiences, which you could also call spiritual experiences, or higher states of consciousness they're sometimes called. I collected about 150 or more examples, reports of awakening experiences, and I was interested in finding out what are the sources, what are the situations when these experiences of meaning and connection and sense of wonder and beauty, these moments when we feel intensely alive and intensely connected, what are the situations when these experiences occur? What are the causes, if any, of these experiences? And as I expected, quite a few of the experiences were caused by meditation and prayer. A lot of them occurred in nature, so that they were seemingly caused by a connection with nature. And other causes were sexual experiences, sport, when people were running or swimming, they'd suddenly switch into a spiritual state of being. But I found out that the most frequent cause of these experiences was actually depression and turmoil and loss. These negative states seemingly have a power to engineer a shift into a different state of consciousness. So I think it was around 20% of all the awakening experiences I collected were caused by states of suffering and loss. So it could be people, for example, people who were even something very simple where, you know, I was given a report by a teenage girl whose boyfriend had left her, and in this state of turmoil, something emerged inside her and she shifted into a state of well-being. But there were other much more serious situations, much more serious kinds of loss and suffering. I spoke to people who'd become disabled, people who'd undergone nervous breakdowns, suffered bereavement, people who'd lost everything through alcoholism or drug addiction. But I began to seek out experiences where people had undergone this spiritual shift. And one of the interesting things was that whereas normally when we have spiritual experiences, they're temporary, they last for could be a few seconds, a few hours, possibly even a day or two. But often they fade away and we slip back into our old normal state of being. But I found that many of the people who'd undergone this spiritual shift through turmoil and suffering, they never slipped back into ordinary consciousness. They continued to live in a spiritual state. So they found that they experienced a continual sense of inner well-being, a sense of appreciation, a sense of how lucky they were, even if they were living in very difficult circumstances like being disabled or being in prison, for example. They still had a sense of appreciation. And they expected this state to fade away. But after months, after years, even in some cases decades, it remained constant. They never lost this spiritual state. And so I collected some really fascinating and inspiring stories. Maybe I'll just tell you, we haven't got much time, so I'll tell you one story which I collected in the book. And this was a guy I interviewed called Michael Hutchison, who was he was a successful author in the 80s and early 90s, successful author of books on science and spirituality. I think he wrote a successful book called Mega Brain, which maybe there's even a copy here. It's quite a well-known book. But he had a serious accident when he was running and became paralysed, and obviously he was in a state of deep depression for a long time. He'd lost all the activities which he enjoyed. He could no longer write, could no longer use an enthusiastic sportsman and runner, he could no longer play sports or go running. And for 2 years or so he was in a state of deep despair, especially because he was in America and his medical insurance ran out, so he ended up in a terrible institution with lots of psychiatric patients who were screaming and creating a very difficult environment. But one day he was being taken for a shower in his wheelchair, and he suddenly heard a voice in his head which said, "What are you doing? Why are you resisting? Just let go." And at that moment he made a mental effort. He realised that all the knowledge he'd had about spirituality, that he wasn't applying it in his own life. He realised he had no choice but to accept his predicament. So he made a mental effort just to accept his predicament as a disabled person, a person who'd lost all the activities he'd enjoyed. And right at that moment, the moment of acceptance, he underwent this shift. Something broke away inside him and he fell into a state of bliss. He suddenly felt this energy rise up and engulf his whole being. This energy which was a blissful energy which gave him a sense of connection to something profound in the universe. And that's never left him. He's still, even now, 15 years later, he still exists in this state of permanent, continual well-being. And even he's still in continual pain, but it doesn't bother him because he deals with his pain by falling into, he calls it, he falls into bliss whenever he feels pain. He just lets go and falls into bliss. And so there are lots of fascinating stories like that.